Okay, let's get into this. I just want to pray before we start. Lord, I thank you for every person that is part of this today that will watch this in the days to come. I thank you that every life matters. There's a great love that you have for us, and it's hard to understand that. But I just thank you that you have answers where we only have questions, and I thank you for your answers. And we're going to look at some of those today. I thank you, Lord. Do you know if you were to help me this morning to make up a list of what emotional exhaustion looks like, it could be a very long list. In fact, it would probably include things like, I don't know, lack of motivation, being a bit touchy and irritable about things, almost a sense of dread. Those would be on the list. But if we were to make a list that caused all those things, that could be even a longer list. And so I think I can actually make that list just into one word: life. Life can suck the life out of us, but that's not how God planned it. And God has answers where we don't. And so today, I just want us to look at two areas that there are answers for. And the first is actually, what does emotional health, emotional maturity, what does that look like? And second, which is probably even a better question, is how do we experience that? How do we get that into every part of our life? Now, if you were to ask Mr. Google that question, Mr. Google would tell you that he would say maybe eliminate stress, eat healthier, get more sleep, exercise. Like exercise, I think you're meant to do that in the morning before your brain wakes up. But exercise would be one of the things that Mr. Google would tell us about. But see, for me, I just try to keep it pretty simple. If you want to renovate your kitchen, why would you start in the bathroom? Like, why not go to God? Because every time Jesus dealt with humanity, he went to the heart of the issue. He went directly to what the problems were, and his answers were very specific to people's needs. In fact, James, the brother of Jesus, he had the same process. He dealt with things very clearly and very deliberately. If you are emotionally worn out, if you're emotionally exhausted, if you're fragile, if you're hurting, you know that relational conflict is not very far away. When we're feeling like that, it doesn't take much to just, it all comes out. Well, James is helping us deal with this, and he asks this question. It's a very direct question. He says, what causes fights and quarrels amongst you? And he's not talking to some Facebook group. He's talking to Christians. And not just Christians, Christians that are in churches, Christians that are in families, Christians that are friends with each other. And he asks this question. And then he goes on and he says, don't they come from your desires that battle within you? And he says this: you want something, but you don't get it. I think James could be describing my 4 grandkids, but he's not. He's talking to us. He's talking about heart issues. He's talking about how we can experience emotional health and healing in our life. And there's a book by a guy called Peter Scazzaro, and he's written this book, and it's called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. And in this book, he describes emotional infants right through to emotional adults. And it's not based on age, because, see, adults that are what he would describe as emotional children. And he has some little lists, and I want to go through a few of those this morning. And he talks about emotional children as being, they sort of look after, they take care of themselves. That's it. They have difficulty entering the world of other people. They're driven by a need for instant gratification, and they use others to as objects to meet their needs. And I was thinking about this, and I thought how that the hold of pornography, how that hold has on really good people, it's not broken by willpower. It's not broken or changed even by prayers of asking God to forgive us. It comes from emotional health. That's where the freedom is. And that healing that James describes, it is a healing that is, in his words, your desires that battle within you. And Peter Scazzaro, boy, that's a hard name I'll just call him Peter, right? But he's written this book, and he goes on to describe emotional children. Now, as I go through some of these descriptives, if you sort of can identify these in the person sitting beside you, don't just give them a nudge and say, hey, that's you, or sort of look at him knowingly. Just pretend that he's describing you. Don't point out someone else, right? But emotional children are content and happy as long as they get what they want. They unravel quickly from stress and disappointments and trials. They interpret disagreements as a personal offence, and they are easily hurt. They complain, withdraw, manipulate, take revenge, become sarcastic when they don't get what they want. I think in the early days of our marriage, I think Coral was married to an emotional child. And these same people that are struggling in this area of emotional maturity and growth, they have great difficulty calmly describing their needs and wants in a mature and loving way. They're like what James said, you don't get what you want and everything else falls apart. All the emotion, all the relationship is all on the line. And then he moves to emotional adolescents, who tend to still be very defensive, are threatened and alarmed by criticism, and they keep score of what they give so that they can return sometimes later and ask for something. And that will be a shock for you if you don't keep score and someone comes and says, look, I've done this, this and this, so can I now have that? That's a surprise if you're emotionally mature. But there are people that's the way they process life. They also deal with conflict poorly and often blame others and almost go to a third party. They want to run to the umpire. They want to look in the rule book. I struggle when people do that in my world. It's a shock to me. And they also can throw a dummy spit, a tantrum, or just completely ignore the issues in their life. They become preoccupied with themselves. It's like, when you're talking to someone and they've spent forever talking about themselves, and eventually they stop and says, oh, I think I better stop talking about myself. So what do you think of me? Right? That's what I mean about preoccupied with yourself. And I've been guilty of that. And they have great difficulty truly listening to another person's pain, to the disappointments that someone else has experienced or someone else's needs. And they can be critical and judgmental. Emotional adults are different. And this is what an emotional healthy life looks like. And James tells us it takes a certain kind of humility to get to this place. I used to think that if I was just a little bit more humble, I'd be perfect. But that is not the sort of humility that James is talking about. And James is giving us an antidote for emotional immaturity, for emotional hurting, for being stressed and feeling damaged and broken inside, being emotionally exhausted. This antidote, he says, and this is what he says, humble yourselves before the Lord and he will lift you up. Now, Daniel's about 23. And I've asked Daniel if I could share this. And Daniel's part of Red Gummies, one of the camera guys operating things here this morning. And he prayed this prayer at the start of this year. He said, God, I want some challenges. I want to experience you for real in my life. And he has. And he has experienced challenges. He's come into things and situations that he's never been before. But you know what I love about Daniel and why I can see him growing and maturing through these challenges is that he is humble to ask for advice. He's willing to learn from someone else. And that's the sort of humility that James is talking about. Emotional adults, they're able to ask for what they need, what they'd prefer, and they can do it clearly, and they can do it honestly and directly. They recognise and manage, and they take responsibility for their own thoughts and feelings. And when they're under stress, they can actually state what they believe, their values, without feeling like they have to have a go at someone or be defensive and prove they're right. And they respect others without having to change them. That can be really helpful in a marriage, because so often we will marry someone very different to us, and to be able to really genuinely appreciate the differences, that takes maturity. They also give people room to make mistakes and not be perfect, and I think that's really helpful in the life of a church. It's particularly helpful in the life of a family. If you're a child and you've grown up in a family where you were not allowed to make mistakes, where you were jumped on for anything you did wrong, that can be crushing for a child. Emotional adults appreciate people for who they are, for the good, the bad, the ugly, and they appreciate people not for what they can do for them, but just for who they are. They accurately assess their own limits, their strengths, their weaknesses, and are able to freely discuss those with others. A number of years ago here in Bairnsdale, we had a youth team meeting one night, and just before we started, one of the team, almost like a spokesman, said, "Lex, just stop. Before we go anywhere, I've asked everyone to come tonight with a list of your weaknesses." And when I was telling this story to a pastor friend of mine in Sydney, he goes, "What? Oh," and he was really getting upset. I said, No, you're missing what happened. When they went around the room and told me all the things that I was bad at, all my weaknesses, all my limitations, they were doing it to cover where I was weak. And I walked out of there that night feeling so loved, because these people were honest enough to tell me where I was holding the team back. And if they could cover me for where I was weak, how much better we would go. And it takes maturity to get there. And that night helped me in my growth, in me being able to see things that I'd been blind to. Mature, emotional adults also are able to deeply be in tune with their own emotional world and able to enter the feelings of other people, their needs, their concerns, and without losing themselves in the process. They also have a capacity to resolve conflict maturely and to negotiate solutions and to consider how someone else sees things. Now, I love Pete and Colleen, who are part of Red Gum, and Colleen also gave me permission to share some of her journey just recently. Colleen had had a long-term relationship with someone that had got to the place where they weren't even talking with each other. It had become so stressed and fragile, this relationship. And then something important came up. And Colleen tells me that she jumped to the wrong conclusion. And she was getting really turmoiled up inside. She was just stressed over this situation, and she didn't really quite know what to do. And so she asked Coral and I if we could pray with her. She wanted to humble herself. She wanted to get a God perspective on what to do. And as we prayed about it, I believe God showed Colleen that she could now start to see things through this other person's eyes, and that she could see that she had jumped to a wrong conclusion. And so she rang this person, she apologised, she listened to how the other person saw the circumstances. And do you know what happened? They ended up chatting for an hour and a half on the phone. They reconnected. They've arranged to catch up again in person, and everything hung on that humility to be willing to see things through someone else's eyes and to not jump to that conclusion. And she was able to be free and the relationship restored. Because every time we make a wrong assumption, we are seeing life through a lens that's a lie, or a half-truth, and we react emotionally as if it's true, but it's not. And if we can do what James said, to humble ourselves before God, He will lift us up. He will help sort out the things. Now, when we began this series on relationship and emotional health, I certainly didn't have all the answers. But I just knew if we could begin, the Holy Spirit would direct us, that He would give answers to questions that we were asking, that we were searching for. And as I sort of got working through this week, I got caught a little bit by surprise that there was an answer that I'd not really seen before. I sort of discovered that there is a way of responding that Jesus has modeled for us, that He's taught. It's been my personal experience in my life, and yet I'd overlooked it. I hadn't seen the significance of it. And so I want us to look at that right now, because when Jesus was here on earth, there were the religious people in His day that overlooked this, that didn't see it, that misunderstood what Jesus was doing. They were passionate about God being the center of their lives. They would, I don't know if you can believe this, but they actually would memorize the first 5 books of the Bible. Some of us struggle knowing what our number plate is, but they would memorize these books, and then they would pray 5 times a day, and they'd give 10% of all their money to the poor. And yet they missed something. They were doing certain things, but their problem was that they were God worshippers, but they saw other people as theys and thems, and not as me, myself. And Jesus copped a fair hammering on social media from these people. Every time that Jesus hung out with the theys and the thems, they'd have a go at Him. And they said, hey, Jesus is hanging out with tax collectors and sinners. And Jesus did that deliberately. And He did it for the people who He's hanging out with. And He did it to model something for us, to help us gain emotional health and maturity. And there came a day when these Pharisees, these rule keepers, they tried to set Jesus up. They tried to trick Him. I'm just glad that they have not been in charge of Victoria during the COVID crisis. The rules that they would have inflicted on us would have been horrific. Anyway, in their way to trick Jesus, they asked Him this question. They said, Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Now, you've probably heard of the Big Ten, but they'd added about another 600 plus on top of that. And so Jesus replied with this answer. He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and all your strength. And this is the first and the greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Hang on. They weren't asking for 2. They wanted 1. But Jesus is not giving them exactly what they want. He's giving them 2, and He will not separate the second one. And He says, love your neighbour as yourself. And just to drive this thing home, He says, all the law, all those books that you memorize, you melt it down into this. All those books of prophets in the Old Testament, all of this hangs on these 2 commandments. What was Jesus saying? What's He saying? If you want to experience true emotional and relational health, put all your eggs into both baskets. The religious leaders are focused on just one basket, God. It doesn't work if we focus just on God. They were focused on God, and yet they killed his son. And they killed Jesus out of emotional immaturity. Their responses to Jesus just showed incredible emotional immaturity. They'd related to God through law, through a punishment lens. I want to say something, and it will seem like just a little moment in this message, but there's a lot of power and a lot of truth in what I'm about to say. Law keepers don't mature emotionally because law keepers haven't been fully set free from that punishment mindset. They have not yet fully experienced the grace, the mercy of God that sets us free and enables us to grow, enables us to be healed. And when they set out to trap Jesus, Jesus did not answer with this statement. He did not say this: love God and love people. I know it's a great slogan for churches to use, but Jesus never said it. And I'll tell you why he never said it. Because when you bring it back down to that, when you simplify it to that, it takes all the power out of it. It robs it of the very thing that Jesus was wanting to get through to us. It creates this wrong image in our minds, because the full experience that Jesus wants us to know is that loving God involves our emotions, our minds, our strength, our humanity. Because, see, we are wired as emotional people. We are to relate to God emotionally. Some Christians are scared of emotions, but God put them in here for reasons. And our minds are rational. God wants us to be able to have logical understanding of Him, to give an answer to someone that makes sense, that's been thought through. That when He says to love God with all our strength, that's our energy. He didn't say time. Time is limited, but energy can be renewed. And God promises to renew our energy. And our humanity keeps it real. It keeps us authentic in how we are relating to God and to each other. But that's just one basket. The second basket, which Jesus described, He didn't say love people. Because I find some people are really easy to love. Like the other day, our daughter, her husband, kids have shifted down from Sydney. We've had a huge trip up and back and everything. And Kath rolls up with enough food to feed the whole lot of us. We didn't have to cook a meal that night. That's easy to love Kath when she does that. Someone invited Jesse, my little grandson, and I out for tea the other night at their home. It's so easy to love people who do things for us, who are kind. But Jesus picked a very special group of people to love. He described them as neighbours. And they're not a geographic neighbour. They're not the person next door. When he was asked who's our neighbour, he described a person in strife, someone in need. He told a story of a good Samaritan. It's someone that can't necessarily do a favour back to you. It's someone that's in need, someone that needs love as a gift. It's not something that they can earn. It's love with no strings attached. But here's the big thing that little slogan leaves out. It's to love people as ourself. It's to love them as me, myself, and not see other people as they and them, like the Pharisees did in Jesus' day. And when Paul is telling us in Galatians how to restore someone that's messed up, he said do it gently, but do it as if you're seeing yourself in them. That's how we'd approach people, seeing them as me. That would be me if I'd been in those situations. A huge step to emotional healing and maturity comes when we put all our eggs into two baskets. The basket of relating to God and the basket of relating to others, especially those in need. And Jesus modeled that and He taught it. And Luke, in a commentary of Jesus' growth and development as a human being, he says this: and Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favour with God and man. 2 baskets, all their eggs. I want to finish with this story. In Nepal, there was a man named Sindar Singh, and every year he would go up high into the mountains and cross over into some of the remote little villages to share the story of Jesus with people. And it was his annual trip to go up over the mountains, and someone in his village asked if they could come along with him. They knew he was heading up, so they climbed together high up into the mountains in Nepal. But this big blizzard came in, and it got worse and worse, and they were trying to work out whether to go back or keep going. And they came across another person that was coming from the opposite direction who had fallen and broken a leg, and they were in a really bad way. And Sindar Singh decided to try and help this man. But the traveller that had come with him didn't want a bar of it. He decided no, it was too dangerous. It would slow them down trying to save this man's life. So he chose to go back by himself. But Sindar couldn't leave this man with a broken leg, so he helped him up, and somehow he grabbed him and dragged him, and they limped together, and they slowly came down the mountain while this blizzard's raging. As they got down lower, they came across the first man that had gone back to the village, but he had actually died from exposure. See, it was Sindar and the injured man's body temperatures, body warmth together that kept them alive. And sometimes in life, the person that you reach out to help, the life that you save in those situations, it can be your own. And Jesus created us to have relationship with him and relationship with others. But the healing, the wholeness comes when we also reach out to people that are in need. I just want to thank you for being part of Red Gum. I appreciate you watching. I appreciate you being connected to us. We really love to hear from you, and I'd encourage you to keep communicating, keep asking us questions, keep talking to us. It's really valuable, and we love you. And I'm going to hand back to Amy, and I'll see you down the cafe soon.